welcome back to join your two favorite co-hosts. This is Perspectives with.
Lisette.
See, I told you I was gonna do you first because it's usually I say me. But your name comes first, or your letter comes first in the alphabet, so it just makes sense. And I am. I forgot my name. I am Martina. Yes. And so it's been a long day, as all three of us was just chatting about. But welcome to our lovely podcast, our video, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on Spotify or iTunes. Welcome. Welcome to people who are new, and welcome back for people that usually tune in and join us. But today we are continuing our series of speaking with nonprofit leaders. Really, we've had some really good guests, and we're continuing with that today. And we will turn it over to her in just a bit. But I'll kick it over to Lisette to say anything she'd like to say.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Martina. But yeah, I'm excited for today's conversation. Our guest today has a strong background on housing. So I'm excited to dig in a little bit on housing, but she's also a leader in nonprofit, and I'm excited to just kind of have her join in, be part of this conversation, be part of our little kind of community here. But yeah, I think today is going to be a really good conversation. This will be part one of two. Coincidentally, her name is Lisette. But she ends with the T and I end with the TH. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Yeah, I think, I'm going to turn it over to you, Lisette, give you a chance to just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about, where you're from. Are you from Chicago? Did you grow up here? Tell us a little bit about that and just a little bit of your journey kind of, growing up, but also how did you end up in this industry that, we're kind of discussing today, nonprofit?
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for having me on. I'm really honored. So like was said, my name is Lisette. I am Chicago born and raised. I've made it through several neighborhoods. When I was born to parents that were living in Lincoln Park. This was in the 1980s, when Lincoln Park was more affordable. And then the affordability sort of like ran out. And so when my homemaker mother and my dad, who worked in banquets and hotels, looked around and they were like, oh, okay, so we want to buy a house, we can't do it here. And so they ended up buying a house in what was then very scary Logan Square. Not quite like that anymore.
Nope.
It is popping these days. And I'm definitely that cranky old person that's like, where did all these people come from? But yeah, and so I got involved with like neighborhood organizations. I was really fortunate to have incredible mentors and people that really saw like a lot of potential in me, and were like, yes, you should do these things, you should get involved. They're the ones who deeply, I think, instilled like caring. Every once in a while I look around and I'm like, I wish I was a person who just didn't care sometimes because I'm tired. But like I care. And a lot of it has to do with like the folks that really raised me up, maybe not in the most strictest parental sense, but certainly who raised me up in organizing, who raised me up in community, and who raised me up in leadership. And those were the same people who like heard my story and heard my family's story and were like, oh yeah, that's gentrification. And I was like, cool, no idea what that is. And spent like the next few years really learning both the technical definition of gentrification and then like living it and experiencing it firsthand. Obviously, again, when my family moved from Lincoln Park to Logan Square, that was gentrification. And then we watched the neighborhood change drastically around us as it continues to do today. Like just this weekend, there was article in the Chicago Tribune talking about gentrification in Logan Square, and it continues to be a really hot topic. So I ended up doing housing work because it was my story and it was a thing that like people were like, well, you know this firsthand. And I don't know how, but like 20 years later, here I am. And it's like, okay, I've now done housing work my entire life. I've done direct service work. I've done it in leadership and raising money. I've done it in some organizing. I've done it in like leading organizations. I understand and have been really fortunate to learn housing from all perspectives. And it's a rough world out here some days, mostly because it shouldn't be this hard. Housing should be like a human right, and it should be something that everyone just has. And you look around at all of the ways in which we have to fight at every level, and you're like, all right, this shouldn't be this hard, but it is. And so, some days are long.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something that resonated with me when you said, I wish I was someone that didn't care.
Mhm.
Like, there are so many moments that I know I probably mentioned this to Martina as well. Like, I just wish I didn't care. I wish I could just, go on my day, do what I gotta do, and just come home and not care about anything. And it's like, because it's exhausting, to your point, like it's very tiring because especially with nonprofit, you bring that home
Mhm.
all the time. Like at least I do.
Yeah.
Maybe not everybody in nonprofit does, but if you're in it for the right reasons and you're there and you care, like you bring it home. Like I live in the communities that,
Mhm.
a lot of organizations serve. And it's
Mhm.
like, it's exhausting to see how little things have improved, but
Mhm.
how much work I know is going on. And
Mhm.
it's like, but you don't see the impact. Like you don't really see it. And it's like years of work and
Mhm.
one good thing happens, but there's like 100 other things that still need to be fixed. So that
Yeah.
so resonated with me, that whole idea of like, I wish I could just look away and
Turn away.
Yeah, this has been a common conversation among friends where it's like, who did this to us? Who implanted this like seed of community and was like, yes, like we care about others and we fight for justice and we do the right thing. It's like, who did that to me? Because
why?
it is a rough life out here, and even at the moments where it's like I'm gonna run away and like live in like the middle of nowhere, it's like I'll just bring this with me because it's inside of
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how to turn it away, but I do. I like go on social media and I'm like, cool, how do you do that? How do you just live this life without being like, oh my God, what about my neighbor? And what about this unfair thing that's happening? So I think it's too late for me. I think I'm never gonna learn that. I think I'm always gonna bring these things home. So
But I heard you talk about gentrification from two different angles. Actually, you were talking about when your parents left Lincoln Park and went to Logan Square. They were gentrifying, coming to that area. And I think, I would love for you to explain or tell your definition of gentrification, because by working in the nonprofit industry, I'm currently not, but most of my career I have been in nonprofit. And one thing I learned kind of early on is that I can be a gentrifier. I am a gentrifier. Like, well, I'm not even from Chicago. Okay, so I moved here from the South. And when I came here for graduate school, I lived on campus for a year, but that's where I moved Logan Square, Avondale. And so that's currently where I'm at now. And I started working and all that and working in nonprofit and learned that I can also be a gentrifier, because I wasn't necessarily seeing myself as like, oh, I can be a part of the problem. Not to say that you and your parents were part of the problem, but I think some people feel that gentrifiers may not look like us. They may be the others, but we can come into a neighborhood and be gentrifiers as well. So I just found that really interesting that you said that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know, particularly thinking through like the Latinx community, there's been a lot of really great like TV shows that have like tackled that, like Vida on Stars, a couple other shows that I know, like I've like watched some episodes here and there, but that really tackle that whole idea of like gentrification in our communities happening by people that look like us, who come from the same places we do, but are maybe at a different socioeconomic status at some point. But I think like the very basic definition for me of gentrification really starts at where my parents started. which is that they looked around and they were like, okay, we've been living in this neighborhood for a bunch of years, so we'd like to stay here. Our kids are going to school here. We walk to church from here, and then looked around and were like, oh yeah, can't do that because all of the houses that have been built and all the rehabs that have been done and everything that's been torn down and rebuilt is all way out of our price range, and my dad like made decent money for someone who was like supporting a family in like the 80s and 90s. Like it wasn't like bad money, it was just still like, okay, but this is still not meant for us, like my dad was union at the hotels, again, like earned decent money, but you needed way more than that in order for qualifying for a mortgage in that area. And so in housing, we often talk about the drive till you qualify phenomenon, right? And so like you like drive out until you qualify, usually from wherever you're at, you're driving, depending on where you're at in the city of Chicago, in the area, you're certainly driving south or west, till you qualify for something. And so that's essentially what they did, and we were fortunate in that we found a home that was everything that both my parents wanted, right? My dad, being the like sole breadwinner in the house, was like, I need to have like rental income. I need to have like something else that we can rely on if something goes wrong, and my mom was like, I've got 3 children who are all on top of each other in this like tiny 2-bedroom rear apartment that we were living in. I need them to have some space. And so we found that. And it was great. But yes, being a landlord also puts you in a different position often than, when you are a renter. And like that is, in and of itself, like some part of gentrification, I think. But what we watched too was that we came in and we're like, okay, like there's people around here that look like us. And then those are the same people that got pushed out because, for example, in places like Logan Square, there's such a high amount of rental stock. And so, when your house is foreclosed on, or when you decide to sell your house, it's not just you as the landlord, it's like the people that you were renting to as well. And in the case of Logan Square, it has not been the term that is sometimes used in Latinx communities is gentrification, like play on gente and gentrification. There's not been gentrification around here. This has definitely been gentrification. There's a professor, I think he's teaching at DePaul University now, but I saw a presentation by him many years ago. And the thing that he said in his like gentrification studies that he came across is that like when he would talk about what gentrification is, people would be like, oh, when the white people come. It's like,
Yeah.
Yes, for many of us, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, I think there's different phenomena that we see now, but at the core of it, it is still racial because race is tied to economics. And, that's a whole other conversation about, race and economics and socioeconomic status for white folks versus for people of color. So yeah, it can be different, but certainly our experience was that of like, okay, white folks have moved into Lincoln Park and they bring with them a different socioeconomic status. The other thing that I just remember like happening over the years was it's not just housing, it's the makeup and the other things that are happening in the neighborhood. So I think within a couple of years of us moving out of out of Lincoln Park and into Logan Square, I remember my godmother getting married at one of the local churches in Lincoln Park still, because that's where we had been going before. And by the time she did that, I don't think that church had a Spanish Mass anymore, because there just wasn't much of a population left. And so they didn't need a Spanish Mass. And so they literally didn't have it. And, when we think of like the little corner stores where we went and my mom spoke to folks in Spanish, those also started to disappear. And so there's a part of it where you like look around and it's like, I mean, you could fight to stay here, but all the things and that are familiar to you are also gone. So like, how do you make the things that you need to make for, the sauce for dinner or whatever, if like the local grocery store doesn't carry those ingredients anymore? And so that is also very much part of gentrification. And that's what we've seen in Logan Square as well. You know, where there used to be fruterias, like there no longer are. And like you have to go further and further to like get all the ingredients for like your dinner, because what is here locally isn't exactly carrying all that stuff. So yeah, I think all of that is part of gentrification.
Jump in, Lisette.
No, I think thank you for sharing sort of some pictures of what gentrification looks like. Because a lot of the times, at least for me, I always think about it, yeah, it's white people coming in. Like that's sort of what I think it's always been, and a lot of the times it is still that. But when you said gentrification, right? Like I remember I heard it once before, and it was some video or documentary that I probably was watching around it, and I think there's so much. I feel there's so much responsibility as a Latina, you know, being in a, whether you think just, you know, socioeconomically better off than maybe others. If I do plan on going into a neighborhood like, you know, a Logan Square, like a Little Village, like a Pilsen, you know, what responsibility do I have as a Latina to ensure that the people that have been there can continue to be there if they choose to want to be there, right? And to allow that. And I think that's such a part of the conversation that's missing when you're talking about gentrification, of like, okay, how do we as, you know, people of color coming into any neighborhood, whether it's predominantly Black, whether it's predominantly Latino, Asian, like, you know, if you're coming into these neighborhoods, how do you do it in a way that doesn't displace people? You know, you're fortunate enough to be better off maybe, and you're fortunate to be able to afford these, you know, higher, you know, rents and things like that. But how do you do it, and how do you advocate for there to be affordable housing? How do you do that? And I think it's hard, because you're like, some people are like, are the people that don't really care, and they're like, hey, I can afford it, I worked hard and all these things, and nobody's negating that you worked hard to get to where you're at. But the people that are there have also worked hard to continue to live there, and continue to work hard to afford and live there, and have that. And to your point of like, do you continue fighting when all of the things you've known of that major community, your community, are no longer there or disappearing? Do you fight for it, or do you just say off to the next neighborhood and hope for the best over there? Because it is kind of sad when you see the landscape. I think for me always comes to mind Pilsen, you know, because that's sort of you know, one of the things where I've seen a huge difference, you know, just in the last, you know, you think just in the last even 5 years, you know, you don't have to go back, but just if you think in the last 15 years of Pilsen, like things have changed, and things like Logan Square and things like that. And it's like, there's a lot of conversations yet to be had. But when you think about kind of coming into neighborhoods, or people wanting to say, hey, we want to beautify the community, we want to make it better, like, is there a way to do it without seeing sort of the negative effects, right? Is there a way to kind of come in and say, yes, we're going to make this community, you know, and we're going to come out to, you know, West Lawn out here on the Southwest side, and we're going to bring in, you know, some small businesses, some coffee shops, we're going to do all these things, we're going to, you know, have bike lanes, and we're going to do all these things that, you know, other neighborhoods have, but to do it in a way that doesn't raise the property taxes, it doesn't raise somebody's rent, you know, the cost of rent, that doesn't displace. Is there a way, or are there ways to do something to kind of better our communities without kind of having to go into the negative side of, or not the negative side, but just gentrifying a place and losing its essence and its culture and sort of community?
Yeah, I feel like we started having a lot of these conversations a lot because there are a ton of people who don't care, who are the like, I'm good, whatever. And then there's definitely people that like moved into Logan Square and looked around and were like, oh, okay, I might be part of the problem. How do I offset this? What do I have to do this, right? And part of what I think many of us have always said is you got to follow the lead of the community that's been here, right? Like, it's not that we won't welcome someone else who wants to come in, but you have to understand what that impact is. And you have to be willing to put in work to like offset that impact. You know, is it getting involved in the local community organization? Is it using your privilege to like raise the voices of those who have been shouting and aren't being heard? You know, like, there is a lot of work to be done, and community has the answers. Community knows what they need. Like, that park that's been all messed up and the swings that are broken, they know that. They've tried. They've like made calls, and like some people aren't listening. And so how do you add your voice and whatever privilege you have to like back what the community's already been trying to do? I think part of the mistake that people make when they come into a community, I've heard this term, which is very appropriate for this work, right? It's the Columbusing of a community, right? Where you like come in and you're like, this did not exist before me. And it's like, no, it existed before you. There were people working here, there were people doing things, there were people living here, and there were people that were working to, you know, like transform the community into the community that they want it to be. Like, you have to acknowledge that. You have to acknowledge that there's a whole thing here, and then you have to figure out where the best place is for you to keep working with that community. But it has to be something where the folks who have been there, who have tried, are really the ones who are taking the lead on that, you know? And it's like, if you want a small business, it's like, great. Have you talked to the community about what kind of small business that they need? Or are you just gonna like come in and be like, oh, you know what, this community doesn't have, it should be this, and like, let's do it, let's go for it, you know? Like, doesn't matter whether or not the community wants it. And it also, you know, it has to be about like where the community is at in terms of like its own status, right? Like, what are the things that you are doing that you're bringing to the community that may be unaffordable for them? And it's like, again, when you start talking about bringing business or bringing products or bringing whatever into the community, it's like, well, who is it for? Because if it is meant for the people of this community, then number one, they would have told you that this is the thing that they need. And number two, you make sure that it is affordable and it is something that works for them. And I think often what we see at the moment where it feels like the height of gentrification, it's like a store that's selling something. You're like, what the heck are they even selling? And like, who would pay that much money for that thing that they're selling? Right? Because you sit there and you're like, I don't understand. And I think that like, those are the moments that are the height of gentrification. And I think each community is different. The one thing about Chicago and housing is that I don't think that there is one solution to like all the housing problems across the board, because every community is really different. Every community has been impacted by disinvestment and then by gentrification, or by both, or by one or the other, you know, in any number of ways that are really different. But that's why I think the importance of community and like community leaders being the ones that are at the forefront of like, this is the fight that we're trying to have here. And if you really want to help, you're going to join us here. But like, don't be out here pretending that like we didn't exist before you. Because that is like the height of erasure. And that is, you know, the thing that it's when you start seeing those things that you really see like the erasing of community. And to one of the things you said earlier too, in terms of like, and this is again, I think of community in this way, right? Is that even in those moments where you're like, I don't know why I'm fighting to like be here, it's usually community that's like, well, like there's some of us that are still here and some of us are all still like fighting and some of us are still hanging on. And you know, there's some stuff that can be familiar. And there's also some stuff that like, you know, the new amenities that do come in and you're like, oh no, that's great. You know, my mom's, the love of my mother's life is Target, you know, and they built like a little, like one of those Targets. And my mom's like delighted. It's like 2 blocks from her. You know what? I don't know if she's not the demographic they meant it for, but that's fine. She enjoys it, you know? But in general, like I think of my mom, you know, and my mom's been in that house now for like almost 30 years. And she walks to church and she walks to the bank and she walks to 7-Eleven and, you know, she like walks around the neighborhood and she knows it. And at this point, like if we were to like sell the house, it's like, well, we definitely couldn't afford to buy in Logan Square, even if you're selling in Logan Square. And you know, like her and like, you know, some of like the little old Latina ladies who have like also held on, like they know each other and like they walk together and like they'll go have their coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. And it's like, okay, you know, like that sense of community like that you're still hanging on to is often the thing that makes it like, okay, a lot of this might be unrecognizable. And again, my mom is going to walk past the 6 other coffee shops in Logan Square that are all selling coffee at like some price that she thinks it's outrageous. And she can walk to Dunkin' Donuts with her little friends and, you know, it'll be great. And that's why she hangs on, you know, and I think and maybe this is because it's what I was raised in, right? But it's all about community. You know, it's about the people, it's about like letting the people lead. And I think that that's always going to be the answer, right? It's going to be the answer to why you stay. It's going to be the answer to how you fight. It's going to be the answer to who has the answers. It's always going to be about community.
Yeah, I love that. I love you ended with, you know, it's always gonna be the community, because I think in the line of work that I do, it is the community voice. It is the community that, like you said, has the answers. And even if they don't have the answers, they know what they want. They know what they want to do. They know that there's a way to get to where they want to be. And they just need, you know, maybe just some guidance or just some resources to just get there, things like that. And I think that's the whole point, right? And I think that's such a key thing to really kind of hone in on, of the reason why you continue fighting, whether it's, you know, against gentrification, whether it's you know, racial tensions, you know, all these different things. It's like, it's community, because if you are from Chicago, you know, communities are huge here. Like, that's what it is. Like, people have a lot of pride from the communities that they're from, and what it means, and all of that. So I think it's very I'm glad you kind of ended on that note, at least for that part, like where it's like just kind of really listening to the community. But Martina, I'll let you uh ask or share.
Just have a few questions, and really, so we know now, you know, you're this great nonprofit housing leader, but you know, how was it when you first got into the sector? And I believe you said housing is something that you've always knew that you wanted to work in, but compared to things now, and when you first started, have you seen positive changes? Have there been some negative changes? I'm sure. Have things kind of stayed the same? How has that been for you? Because you mentioned that you've been in this for 20 years.
Yeah, so I actually have, it's funny, my favorite thought that comes to mind is this. So when one of the very first, the big campaigns that I worked on in Logan Square, like I was like a community leader and we were trying to get, I think it's 63 units of affordable housing built. And listening to some of the neighbors who were anti this proposal, who were anti-affordable housing, like testify in front of like city council committees and other things, was some of the most depressing things I've ever done in my life. Like, some of those people were very angry and kind of vile, you know, like really just awful folks. Saying things that you're just like, do you hear yourself? Like, do you hear this thing you are saying about another human being? And, you know, it was terrible. And the most recent really big victory, and so this was maybe, it's been more than 10 years now, I think. And the most recent really big victory in Logan Square is like 100 new units of affordable housing right off of the Logan Square Blue Line. And the big community meeting for that, it's probably, I think they said it was like 500 people. The vast majority of people were in favor of the project. Many of them were local residents who like looked around and were like, uh-oh, I'm a gentrifier. How do I like offset some of this? And who like sat there and were like, no, like we're gonna like, we're with you, like we're gonna fight for this affordable housing development. And it was just like night and day. Like, I had walked into that meeting like very much like I'm ready to do battle, and like everyone was like overwhelmingly like for the project and understood it. And it was just like, okay, we've done some work. Like, and you know, in so many ways, again, Logan Square is unrecognizable today than it was 20 years ago. It's one of those things where it's like, and I think you alluded to this earlier, Lisette, but like, it's this moment, and I have this moment all the time, I don't know if you all do, where like I look in the mirror and I'm like, yeah, I don't look that different than I used to. And then like I find like a picture of myself from like 20 years ago and you're like, oh no, yeah, that's a different person. And that's how gentrification for me has felt like in Logan Square, where it's like day to day, I'm like, is it that different? And then I think, oh no, yeah, this was drastically different 20 years ago. But we do these like bigger things almost, right, where it's like it's taken a couple of decades to get to the point where like Logan Square is a place where you know that you're going to find people who are going to support affordable housing, and it's taken a lot of work, and that's not true everywhere in the city, but even at the city level there's been a lot of work to really keep in mind sort of like racial equity and like to talk about like the big structural problems. There are still tons of problems, in terms of the way we finance affordable housing, in terms of who can afford affordable housing, because affordable housing isn't always affordable. That's the big secret of affordable housing. There has to be more work still on, you know, like one of the other big victories that we won like 20 years ago was the status, like it's known by a lot of things. It's the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which was like, if you need a zoning change, 10% of your units have to be affordable. And then that came back to be highly ineffective in a bunch of different ways, because then it turned out that people were like, okay, sure, but then you're building studios. And it's like, all right, well, that's not meant for like a family of 6. And then it's like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I'll do 10%, you know, but like, that's, you know, 6 units out of like 60. And you're like, oh, okay, this didn't go quite the way that we had hoped. And there's been a lot of more work that has been done to like improve upon that. And I think that we still have a long way to go. I think that affordable housing is in desperate need of like thinking outside the box. You know, the biggest way in which we build affordable housing in this country is through the low-income housing tax credits. That's based on the IRS tax code. The biggest way in which we build affordable housing in this country is based on the IRS tax code. Like, what are we doing? How can that possibly be the case? And so I think that there's lots and lots of things that we still need to do to like make it clear that this is necessary. And I think part of what has begun to happen more recently that I've seen a lot more evidence of is that once upon a time it was like, we need affordable housing for all those poor people that can't afford regular housing. And now we're like, no, we need affordable housing for everyone, because the cost of housing around here is wild. Like, unless you are making excellent money, almost never in the nonprofit world, you know, like you can't afford to like buy or rent in the city of Chicago. And so now it's like very much, and I think this is part of that change, right? Where it's like people are like, okay, it's actually a matter for all of us. It's not just about like those people over there and like I'm doing a good thing, like being charitable and saying like, yes, yeah, of course, affordable housing. It's now much more like, no, we're all in the same boat here. Where like, you know, how can we all afford our rent, and how can we all afford the property taxes, and how can we all do all of these things? And I think that that has also been a very helpful shift in the last, that I've seen probably in the last 20 years.
Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, for me, I look at housing as just being an essential right that somebody has, along with water, food, education. And, you know, we live in a very capitalist society that if they can monetize it, they will monetize anything that they can. And it's interesting you talking about the kind of people now that needs affordable housing, because I was talking to a coworker of mine who who also has a background in housing. And to her, you know, I talked to her for like over like an hour and a half, and I was so worked up chatting with her about it. And I was like, I just don't get it. Like, why is this such a big issue to make sure that people have a stable, safe place to live, a home to live in? And we were talking, and she mentioned, well, you know, to kind of, you know, in the beginning, it was Black and brown folks. And it's like, well, we don't want to help them. Why would we want to help them? And now to hear you say that, oh, now it's not just people based on race. Now that it's expanded to where we got people who may not necessarily look like us, because it is very expensive to live here, but it's also cheaper to live here than it is in New York and LA. I mean, most people, even if you're over six figures, you cannot afford to live in New York City or like LA. And so it's just very interesting here that we are experiencing some of those same issues, but it's taking other people who don't look like us to come along for the ride. And now we're trying to find a situation for it. And it seems to always be the case, from whether it's education or the opioid crisis, you know, it's like these sort of things it takes to when it was affecting just Black and brown or just people of color, we don't care.
Yeah.
But now, oh, well, you know, we got, I don't know, Brad over here. I'm just making up a name. We got Brad over here who's, you know, doing really well. He's, you know, great, but he can't even afford a 1-bedroom, you know, and we got Brad times 100. And so now it's like, oh, well, we got to figure this out. We got to figure this out as a neighborhood or as a city. And like a part of me is happy that people who have been a part of that neighborhood, who have decades in that neighborhood, may finally be getting the help that they need. But at the same time, why were they not getting help all along? You know, it had to be somebody that completely different coming into the neighborhood that you finally get that assistance that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, like we've seen this like huge change in like the demographic, in like the change of heart and the demographic of that change of heart, right, in Logan Square, right, where again you've got, you know, young white folks who have moved into the neighborhood who are like, hell yes, absolutely, affordable housing all day, every day. But yeah, that's not what was happening 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, you know, we were fighting tooth and nail for every achievement in affordable housing. And now it's, you know, it's not easy. You know, we see this all the time. You like read stories about like fights and some very ugly fights in some neighborhoods around housing, you know, but you still see a lot of movement in the way that people feel differently because there's different folks living here, and you're like, okay. I mean, I appreciate you using your privilege this way, I guess. Do I wish that like we could recognize like the dignity and humanity and need of housing for all of us without that? Absolutely. And you know, it's the unfortunate reality of living in the world as it is, even while we're fighting for the world as it should be.
Yeah, I think you both mentioning sort of, you know, how much race plays into all of this. I mean, in almost any issue, problem, like it only becomes an issue to be fixed when, you know, I mean, unfortunately, when white people kind of get impacted, you know, and I think that's just calling it what it is for those that live it. And I think that, and we've seen it, not just in housing, you see it at, you know, pay, you know, as well, like, oh, now it's impact. We gotta look, people can't afford, they can't live off what we thought was something. And I think even when you look at the fight for like minimum wage, because minimum wage still impacts more people of color than anything, like that isn't really like, yeah, let's raise it, let's do something about it, because it isn't seen as what people in this country would deem the majority. A problem for the majority, it's more a problem for the minority, is sort of what it is. And I think even housing, for the longest time was seen like, well, you know, that's a you problem, that's a other people problem, that's, you know, we'll let whatever, you know, kind of thing. And it isn't until more recently particularly I think when the pandemic hit and people started kind of losing things and sort of like, oh no, and now it's seen like, oh, it is an issue. It is something that maybe we should start paying attention to, something that maybe we should do some task forces around. We should start kind of doing more research into it. And it's like, it's always been an issue. Like it has, it's always been there. Like it's not something new, but I think that's it's unfortunate, as you mentioned, Lisette, like, when you're trying to work within how the world is into what it should be, it's such a struggle, right? Because it's like every time like you've made, you've moved up 5 steps, then you're always 10 steps behind because there's always something else coming behind. And I think it's important to have these conversations and to bring them to light. And and it is important to have those allies who say like, yes, we will be there, we'll stand with you, we'll use our privilege however we can. But it's unfortunate that we have to rely on that.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah, and I think part of this is because housing is just such a quintessential part of the American dream, that we're all sold, like we're all supposed to believe in the great big quintessential American dream. And I think, and I'm sure there's some research that's been done on this and someone who could speak better to this than I could, but I think a lot of what has also happened that has opened this up to be more than just Black and brown folks talking about this has been millennials, who have, we've all seen the statistics, like we're not, like millennials aren't advancing at the same rates, they can't buy houses at the same rates, like can't do anything, right? Like we graduated college and like went into like the Great Recession. There's apparently another recession coming, like generationally, we're not at any of the places that we have like traditionally been at in terms of like generations prior to us. And I think that's the other thing that has happened, right? And so now you've got like, jokes about avocado toast out here, like, but it's like, we all know that that's not the answer. And it's because now it's not just people of color, because people of color are always relegated, right? It's a whole generation out here that we're like, we have been monumentally screwed by everything in this country, by the debt, by jobs, by the stagnation of any number of things. And you're just like, okay, cool. And I think, millennials not being able to achieve that quintessential American dream has like been really kind of like, earth shaking for some people, where it's like, what do you mean? It's like, yeah, no, you're like in your 30s and can't afford a house because, we all went to college when you told us to go to college, and now we're all, thousands of dollars in debt, and whatever debt relief there isn't actually going to be,
it's not enough,
helpful. So I think that's the other thing that I think has been has brought housing out of just a like Black and brown issue into like the mainstream, which again, even that, the idea that if it's a Black and brown issue, it's not in the mainstream is it's its own form of problems and racism.
It's such a good point you bring up, because the boomers and those, they're just fascinated. They were like, well, and it's funny, you'll also see articles like, well, if you stop ordering out all the time, maybe you could afford a house. Well, Steve, it doesn't work like that. Maybe you might save a little coin, but not enough for a house. But it is really, you are so right and hit the nail on the head. It has really been disturbing for older generations to be like, you're 35, 40, almost 40, and why don't you have a house? You can't afford a house. Like by the time I was your age, 30, I was married with 3 kids and had a full-time job. And some of that, well, things, the ideas have started to change as well with like millennials and Gen Zs of what family is and all of that. But it is also, you do see more of us and the younger generation. We're not so much having even having kids, because there's no safety nets to have kids. Like have a child and bring it into this world. It is very expensive to have children. I do not have children, but I have friends that do. It is expensive. On top of that, paying for a child, you got to pay a mortgage or a car note. It's just so many different things that I feel like we're just not necessarily afforded because there's no money. And, I think all of us, well, I'll speak for me. College was always my way out. Like, I grew up in a small town in Mississippi. Shout out to Mississippi. They're a little they're a little crazy, a little wild, but that's what it'll always be home state. But I spent most of my time, like, I studied. Education was super important to me, and my parents never had to tell me, like, do good or do good grades. I had a great grade point average, and education was always my way out. And I think for a number of kids of color, it could be the same thing, or like playing sports, or playing an instrument, any of that. I think a lot of kids may see that as being their way out. And I was one of those. But it's like, I get to college, and you really think, you go to college, you graduate, it's going to be so different. It's not. You just got a degree. And nowadays, even having a bachelor degree is not all it's been cracked up to be. I mean, now, hell, a master's, so it's just like things have changed so much. And I think a lot of us who were like made these false promises or these empty promises, we just haven't seen it come to fruition. And, we're just trying to deal with it the best we know how.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that I believe that we don't sell like the American dream harder to anyone than we do to like people of color. Like, we're out here and we sell the American dream hard, and we're like, yes, you got to go to college. This is your way out. This is how you're going to do things. And, we go and we do all these things, and you're like, yeah, nope, still in the hole. Like, this did not change anything, because the thing that doesn't change is race and racism. Because you look at what, the average person of color that graduated from college earns compared to like a white person who graduated from college. Like, there's discrepancies for gender, God, like, once you get to all the intersections, some of us are like, getting hit from all sides. We get hit by gender, we get hit by race, we get hit by socioeconomics, like everything. You're like, okay, well, stuck at the middle of this intersection, unable to afford housing. Like, it's just kind of where you end up. And it is incredibly unfortunate. And it's hard. Like, I think many of us see it, with like older relatives, right? Where you're like, you got to understand how the world has evolved. Like, you got to understand, you got to work with me here about like what has changed so that I can't be, 30 years old and have a house and 2 kids. Like, the world has changed, and it has changed in a lot of ways. And honestly, in some ways it hasn't changed, right? Like, the federal minimum wage hasn't gone up in I don't know how many years. And you're like, see, when the federal minimum wage doesn't go up from whatever it is, $7.25, like, we're not gonna get very far,
And it's an insult. It's really an insult.
And so much of that too is because there's this feeling of like, again, because you're still thinking about the way the world was, when you were young or when you were a certain age. And it's like, minimum wage jobs aren't just for like the kid working after school. Like, there are people who are having to raise families on minimum wage jobs. Like, so we gotta make some adjustments here to like what we expect. But in the city of Chicago, for sure, and I believe this is true for the state of Illinois, like, you cannot afford an apartment anywhere on minimum wage. There's an annual report that comes out called Out of Reach, and I believe that in their last report it was like there's nowhere where you can afford an apartment on minimum wage. Like, that's just like not a thing you can do. And we have to stop thinking that it's just like teenagers working at Mickey D's after school. Like, that is not what is happening. That is not where people are. So yeah.
Thank you, Lisette, for everything that you have shared on this first part, because it all has been so relevant to just topics that Martina has shared on our podcast, or just had conversations, but just to, where we're at today, not just as a society, but just looking at our city of Chicago, and the different things that are happening here or not happening, as well. So appreciate you kind of sharing that. And I think one of the things that you just said, you know, you're fighting against, you know, racism, right? Like
Mhm.
if racism is there, that's
Mhm.
always going to be a barrier for um forward movement, you know, for improvements. Like that's the thing. And that's such a huge um thing to just continue pointing out. Like we have to tackle that because that is one of the root causes of so many of the injustices, so many of the progress we could be making. It is racism that just stops it. That's point blank zero. That's it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think this is where we're gonna kind of uh conclude this first part. We'll definitely be coming back with Lisette for a second part. And I think that's where we're gonna dig in more into the nonprofit world. You know, and really kind of continue the conversations of disparities and opportunities, and things like that. But if you haven't followed us, make sure to follow us so that you can get notified when part 2 comes out. And we will be back with Lisette, and Martina and myself will be back to talk to you and share more insights around being nonprofit. And we look forward to hear more about nonprofit leadership and what it has been her experience for Lisette in that realm. So thank you all. Thank you, Lisette, again. And we'll be back.
Thank you so much.